The following is intended for informational purposes only. It is intended to supplement classroom training and documentation. It should not be relied on as a replacement or substitute for classroom training with a live expert instructor. This workshop uses process flow to create a custom registration form. This example registration form is for training purposes only. In no way does it replace the existing base registration form. Welcome to Lesson 7 of this Config Tools class. Here we will be discussing how we can embed HTML into the business object and to infuse our business object with information and data which doesn't actually live directly in the business object itself. In other words, most of nearly everything that we've shown so far within the user interface that you see within the BO has come from the fact that the data is actually within the business object itself. What happens if you want to expand it to add other information in? And we will be using our registration form, which we've built up so far, and we will be enhancing the registration form now by adding in a person ID type and value, so that will uniquely define this person, and it will be created as part of the create person step when we actually post the registration form. And what we're going to do now is add in to the registration form type an ID type. So the ID type will control the type of ID that can be created for that particular person, and when we create the actual person, we will not only add in the name, but we will add in the ID value with the ID type. So the first thing that we will do is add in the ID type to the registration form type. By the way, there's another way of doing this. We could have not added the ID type at all to the registration form type and define the ID type directly on the form itself. However, I would like to do it on the type. It will highlight something that I would like to show very soon, and that it only comes out by actually defining the type on the form type. So here is our registration form type, and here already I have added in, you see over here, the ID type. The ID type is a CLOB field. It's going to come from a drop down from the ID type table, and it has a foreign key as well. If I actually now look at my process flow type, you will see that I have already added in to my business and individual an ID type. So on my business I have an ID type. This is the display map showing you with a foreign key to, in this case, the employer identity. If I click on the employer identity, I see that the employer identity actually has an identifier format, as a specific format, and this is something that we're going to talk about in a moment. Going back to here, if I edit this so that you can see the maintenance map, you see that the ID type is actually coming from a drop down Okay, so you have the drop down showing the different values. By the way, sometimes I've actually been running the application in debug mode. You see the debug equals true, and when that happens, the values, the actual real values as well as the description are shown in the drop downs over here. So sometimes you will see that some of my lessons only show, in this case, like driver's license without the parentheses. Parentheses only come up when I actually run it in debug mode. We will have a separate lesson to discuss debug and logging. Won't discuss that now, but just pointing this out that I just see that I'm running under debug. Okay, so we see the ID type running from a table, driven from the table, the ID type table, and that was pretty straightforward. Now, what else do we need to do? We've added the ID type into the registration form type. Now we want to actually set the value on the actual registration form itself. So let's go to the let's have a look at the BO of the registration form. And as the ID that I want to add in is common to both business and individual, I'm going to add it to the parent registration form. And you will see that I've added in a section called ID and has an ID value. And the ID value, again, is a CLOB field, and it's the person ID number, which I have here. So that if I actually now create a new registration form, well, before that, there's another thing that we will obviously need to do, is that is update the code which creates the person. So I've already updated it with a version 5 of the Add Person plugin. If we have a look at it over here, you will see that this is the same as the previous versions, except for that I first of all pick up the ID value from the registration form. Just like I picked up the name, I can pick up the value. Okay? And just like I picked up the person type, I can pick up the ID type. And then when I actually create the person, I add into the person IDs, I can add in the ID type and the person ID number, and that's actually all that I need. And once I have done that, I have a person with not only a name but also an ID. So let's see how that works. If I now go to my create a new registration form, let's try a business one. The ID number is now shown, and I have to make sure that I put it in the right format. 3, 4, 5, and it's got 2 digits, a dash, and then 7 digits, and then I have a name here. For some reason I like using bookstore, and call it bookstore 5, and I'll save that. You see that I have not only a name now, I also have my ID number. If you actually see this, we see it actually you can't see the full value, and that's because we have a special way of hiding the ID number, and we can look at that at a different point where that actually is stored. That's an algorithm, but the point over here is that the ID number is shown, and if I activate, I create my person, and not only have I created my person with a name, I've also created the ID as well. So if I have a look at my person that I've just created, I've created an ID, bookstore, as well as the ID type and the ID number. Okay, so we updated the create person code, we added an ID type on the admin on the registration form type, and on the registration form itself we added the value. Okay, that's the first part of what I wanted to show you. However, there is something that would make this registration form better, and that is I would actually like to see when I fill in the ID type. Even though the ID type comes from is set on the type, is on the registration form type, I don't see that when I fill in the form. Nor do I actually see the format that you need to define for that ID type. Wouldn't it be nice if I could actually add in not add in, but I could see the ID type and format easily. Now, it's not simple to just say, okay, let me just simply add the ID type to the registration form, because there is no field on the registration form for ID type. Is there a question therefore becomes, is there a way of adding in a simple way the ID type to show on the form without actually creating too much customized HTML for this form? And throughout this course, one of my goals is to stick to the basics of using the BO and UI hints to create the interface as simply as possible without creating UI maps. UI maps is an area which allows you to customize the whole look and feel of particular GUI, both for the maintenance maps and also for the display maps. What we have shown is that by using UI hints, you can actually create sophisticated user interface experience without actually having to always create UI maps. So I would like to be able to do that within the context of the BO and the UI hints, and I'm going to show you how to do that. My point here is that there is always a method, and for some people who know UI maps well, this might be preferred, to actually create the whole interface using a HTML UI maps, and you can use JavaScript, and there's a whole language behind that we have given that for implementers to use in order to create sophisticated interfaces. Not part of what I want to show at the moment, so what I want to stick again to what we have within UI hints. So let's go to the way that I now want to show you to add in the ID type and a format, and to actually show it on the actual registration form, even though those fields are not actually included within the BO. So until now, the only fields that we have shown are those fields which are already actually part of an underlying table on the maintenance object, and therefore we can show them on business and we can show them on the BO. So the way to do that is to create a fragment, a UI fragment, and I'm going to show you now the one that we are going to use. I go to my UI map, and here is an example of an XHTML fragment, and this is the one that we're going to use that we can embed into our BO. Okay, there are different types of UI maps, and just mentioned before that you could create your whole interface using HTML documents, a complete HTML document, or you could add in a partially, and there's all different technologies that you can use, and there's a lot of tips over here on the right, valid HTML attributes, to describe all the JavaScript functions that you can use for UI maps. Again, for the last time, I just want to stress that here I'm trying to actually do as little as possible on on JavaScript and UI maps generally, and to stick to the minimum needed to use UI hints and to embed UI maps into a BO using only fragments. And that's what we're going to be doing now. So if I have a look at the schema, you will see that I have created a schema where, first of all, when I use the fragment, I'm not using UI hints. It's enabled, and I have two fields: ID type and ID format. And ID type and format are actually, in fact, hidden fields. They're not actually shown on the UI itself. We're actually using the schema to actually populate the data. But in terms of actually presentation, we're using the HTML, and it's the fields here, ID type and ID format, that we are going to be using in order to actually present the ID type and format within the display maps and also the maintenance maps. Now, it will become clearer, hopefully, in a moment when I show you what we need to do in order to use this fragment. So currently what we have here is simply two fields, ID type, ID format. UI hints are not enabled, and they're suppressed on the interface. If I actually, by the way, do not suppress them, they will be shown twice, not one related to the fact that they're going to be included somehow within our BO, and the fact that the BO has UI hints, it will show them, and it will also show the HTML here. So therefore, here I'm hiding them, not using UI hints, hiding them, going to include them in a moment in my BO, and the only thing that will be shown are the label and the values which are coming from the HTML editor, from the HTML here, shown in the editor. So let me go now to back to my business object, and I'm going to add now, just where I added on my parent BO, in the schema, I'm going to add in an embedded HTML. Let me show you how I do that. So underneath here, I would like to add in add a child element, and I'm going to add in something called embedded HTML. And this is different from many of the other types of elements where the elements are backed by actual data in the database. Here it's coming from that UI map. Whatever what we saw within the HTML editor, that is what is going to be displayed. Okay, so this is a method that you can use to add in data which is not included, which is not backed by actual data in the BO schema. So the fragment here I'm going to pick up is the one I just showed you before. Now, I'd like to just change the order for the ID value and the embedded HTML. I can do that very simply. Just moving it to above the ID value. Okay, so I have a fragment and a value. Now, if I actually now simply let's say I want to add in a new registration form. Let's go to our business. you see I have an ID type and format, but I don't have the values. And so that's coming from these two, ID type, ID format, is coming from my HTML, my embedded HTML. However, the values of the ID type and format have not been added in. How do we do that? We would like to inject into our maintenance map ID type and ID format ID type coming from the registration form type. Okay, so somehow we're going to actually have to inject it. Now, if we want to actually inject data before, as the map comes up, before we actually ourselves enter data, we can use a pre-processing service script. So let me show you that. I can add in my option type a pre-processing service script, which I already have. This one over here. First of all, I'm going to save it. Let me show you what this actual service script looks like. Let's have a look at the schema. The API, the inputs and the outputs for this service script. I have here my action, very similar to the display map service script, and the group with the BO information coming from the parent. You can see it also from there. And also I have in my fragment, I've added in my values. I want to show the ID type and ID format, which is coming from my UI map fragment. And what this script is going to do is going to query the parent registration form and get the type. And from the type, I can go and get my ID type and bring the ID type into the fragment and populate the values here. It can run a business service to actually also populate the ID format. I'm going to add into here another. You see here, retrieve ID type format. I use this business service in order to actually populate the ID format as well. What does the code look like? I have this over here. The pre-processing looks like this. And what I'm doing is, first of all, I'm only interested in populating my my data with a format, not only an add, an update, not on delete. And in this case, what I'm going to be doing is doing a simple, we've seen this already a few times, taking the process flow type, running the, getting the BO by invoking determine BO, and then invoking the BO to get the ID type. Okay, and that is what I want to do. And what I'm doing is, once I have my ID type, I'm putting into the Palm ID type. That is actually populating that data area which is needed to populate the ID type, so that when I show the HTML, it doesn't only show the title to show the label, sorry, but it also shows you the value as well. And not only am I getting the ID type, I'm also getting the ID format, and here I'm actually running a business service. We saw that in the data area a moment ago, invoking the business service and putting the ID format in the same place as the ID type, and now I have the data populated. So how does that reflect on our look of the registration form? Well, let's have a look. So let's just go back to our business object. So we have this pre-processing service script pointing to the script that we just saw. If I now go to process flow again, you'll see that now the ID type and the ID format is now populated, and this is now helpful information such that when I fill in this information here, I should be able to have enough information to fill in the number. Now, in this case though, on the display map, I don't have the ID type and the ID format shown, and if I would like to add that in as well, I will need to add the very similar code that I just showed on the pre-processing, but put it onto the display map service script, because that's what is being used to actually display the data. So in order to do that, I'm going to actually have to update my display map service script both on my if you remember display map service scripts, I have a separate one for both the individual and the business because I had to put it on the child. So in order to do that, I need to add that in. So let me go to my business object, and what I'm going to do, this is my parent, but I'm going to go to the child. This one over here. And it's this place over here that I'm going to actually have to update this display map service script so that it will show the ID type and format. What are the steps I need to do in order to add that in? Well, first of all, I need to change my data area to add in the format. So let me add in the business service there. You save that. That's the first thing I need to do. Not only do I need to do that, I'm going to actually have to add in my schema. I'm going to have to add in the UI map to the schema, because that's what I'm going to be populating. So what I'm going to do here is add in include a map schema. Here I'm not adding in the embedded HTML. The embedded HTML is only on the business object itself. Here I want to add into the actual data area. So it's actually, I want to get the data areas, I need to use an include map schema. And it's the same fragment that I had before. And the fragment, if I remember, was called, I think it's called registration. Let's have a look. It's this one again over here. Save that. So I've added into the data area the format business service. I've added into the schema the UI map that I'm going to use, and I'm going to obviously have to update the code as well necessary to show the ID type and value. And I have the code over here. And the difference here between what we had before previously is that I'm picking up the ID type and I'm doing the ID format. Okay, so in the end we're doing the same move to the ID type and ID format into the data areas that I just included into the schema. whatever I do here, I will obviously need to do also on the individual registration form. We have two of them, two scripts. Now, if I go back to my process flow now, maybe we have it in history, 1 second. Maybe not. Let's just well, let's just create a new one so you can see it for sure. So now I'm going to now create my business one again. Oh, I just see it's in context, so why don't we just use the context? That's the person, sorry, that's not the registration form. So let me just create one. Apologize for that. So we have here the ID type, ID format we just saw before, and the point here is to show that we can not only see on the maintenance map but also on the display map. And lo and behold, under ID we also have the ID type and format, not only now the labels but also the data is actually populated. Okay, so this is what I wanted to show. The main point of this particular exercise is to show you how to use fragments to embed HTML into your maps without necessarily doing too much work in the UI map and creating a whole HTML map. And this is again, think about the embedding HTML as a way of adding data which is not backed by actual values and actual data in the maintenance object, how you would add that and together and mix it together with the existing BO data, and that's what you need to do. You need to actually, in summary, create a fragment, create the values in the schema that you want of the data that you want to add in, hide them because we only going to use the HTML in the HTML editor is what is going to be shown. And then you go to the business object, and there you add in embedded HTML. Once you have added the HTML, you will find you have your labels, and then you have to deal with actually populating the data. In the case for the maintenance maps, then you're going to have to use a pre-processing service script. And then to show it on the display map, you're going to have to update your display map service script to show that data. Okay, so that is what is needed in order to use these embedded HTML using the UI fragments. So in this lesson, where we added in the ID type and value, we've seen some basic enhancements that we needed to do to the create person algorithm to support this. In terms of the technical knowledge that we should have learned from this lesson is the ability to embed an HTML fragment and understand a little more in detail, although we introduced it earlier, but to see how this HTML fragment can be added in to the registration form. And in this particular case, it was the ID type, which is not defined directly on the actual transaction BO, but how it can be shown and embedded into the display map using this embedded HTML fragment which you place upon the BO. And then everything that needs to go in the scripts that need to be added in order to support this mechanism.